Hey, everybody, I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's get to a kind of interesting question. Does economic growth lead to economic development? Is there a connection? And then some people would say yes, but at the same time, when there is increased growth, sometimes they have these negative outcomes, which actually, at least for the short run, can have some really negative impacts on society. So let's take a look. So there are one, two, three, four, 5 ways in which I want you to, or we're going to take a look at the way in which economic growth could or should lead to economic development, and then what you're left to do is to figure out, like, is that really true? So the first thing is higher incomes. Do higher incomes actually lead to an increase in development? Well, it should, right? Of course, higher levels of economic growth lead to higher GDP per person, and to some extent, this should improve the living conditions in a particular country. And maybe over time, right, 100 years or something, this will happen. But oftentimes, that income is very unequally distributed, and as a result, it's hard to say conclusively whether or not it's possible that there's a significant group that will see all of the changes that might happen in an increase in GDP. So while higher incomes are a product of economic development, economic growth, does it lead to economic development? Okay. The second thing is improved economic indicators of welfare. Historically, it is clear that economic growth has led to higher averages in terms of economic indicators of welfare, such as average life expectancy, average years of schooling, and literacy rates. However, this, once again, does not necessarily the case for all sections of the population. And one indicator that you can take a look at is the Human Development Index, and take a look in your textbook to go through the chart, right? But oftentimes there are obviously other factors that contribute to the improvement of HDI, but it suggested that there does appear to be some evidence to show that higher growth rates do lead to an improvement in the overall Human Development Index. Of course, remember, the Human Development Index is this index, obviously, that enables economists to better judge the full development of an economy, as opposed to just looking at economic growth. Okay? The other thing about economic growth, does it lead to economic development? This is true. Governments, the more money people make in a country, the more growth there is, the more gross national income there is, right? The higher the government revenue should be. And if the government has higher revenues, then isn't it true then that they would then be able to more provide public services like education, healthcare, infrastructure? And there's a connection there. And I often had this idea, I'll never do it probably, but if I ever go to get my doctorate in economics, I would do my doctoral thesis on parks, go around the world and make an assessment of governments functioning well and rates of development or states of development based on parks. And if you look at city parks in Europe, for example, and they're like these most beautiful crafted places, they're well kept, right? You see people lying in the grass in the sun, they're playing football, they're doing whatever. But then you go to a park, say, in my experience anyway, in Nicaragua, which is a country I love, but the parks, because the government doesn't have the revenue to take care of them, there are parks, but they're horribly kept, and you don't really see people there, and the kids' equipment is dangerous, and there's no grass, and people aren't hanging out there in the same way that they would hang out in a park somewhere else. And you take a place like Chile, and the parks are nice here, but there are parts of this country that are less developed. So in any event, government revenue should lead to economic development. Does economic development or does economic growth create inequality? Many economists argue that economic growth, especially growth achieved through market-based initiatives, leads to an increase in GDP, but increases inequality, right? And this is the whole theory, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But even if the poor get a little money from this whole economic development, right, because they make less, right, that incremental change in their income percentage-wise can be used to say that they're developing maybe even at a faster rate, which is that's a super controversial statement to make. But there is some connection between, the wealthier the rich getting richer, eventually over time allowing the poor to expand. And if you look at all the industrialized nations in the country, in the world today, there was a time where the rich got super rich really fast, and over time this middle class has emerged. And middle classness is a sign of development. But middle classness is a sign of development because what that means is that somebody got really rich, created a factory, or many people, or the wealthy got wealthy. They created opportunities for jobs in the cities. People left the countryside into the cities, and then cities are where the middle class comes from. Like, middle classness is a sign of urbanization. And so as the rich get richer, they create job opportunities, and over time you will create this middle class, and the wealthiest nations in this world have a huge middle class. Okay. So then lastly, of course, any kind of development, not of course, but negative externalities are a result of development. And this is where I also expand your mind out. If you look at the United States, if you've ever had the joy or pleasure or luck to be able to fly over the eastern portion of the United States, anywhere you see basically east of the Mississippi River, if you don't see trees, somebody cut them down. Like, you could say, maybe not in Florida, but anywhere else, that was one massive forested portion of the continent. And so anytime there are trees cut down, that's deforestation. People don't talk about that because it happened a long time ago, but that's a massive externality of development, right? And maybe in less developed nations, like they talk about, I mean, it's important, right? But as countries industrialize, they tend to abuse their natural resources more quickly. And there's an increase in pollution, like China is a good example, like they're massive polluters right now. Well, the United States and Europe were massive polluters 150 years ago when they were going through this industrialization process that China's going through now. So keep that in mind, right? But the effects on humans of economic growth can lead to things like a lack of safe water. Tropical diseases can move south. Droughts will become more frequent and intense, right? Food production in the tropics can change. And all of this can happen as a result of the lack of sustainability of the same sort of economic growth that we have seen over the course of the last, 150 years. Right? And there's also this guy, and Jocelyn Blink brings this up, and I love the way she said it. Herman Daly is his name. He's an economist, and he talks about this idea of uneconomic growth, which he defines as occurring when the increases in population come at an expense in resources and well-being that is worth more than the items made. In other words, like the production of something that leads to economic growth actually, right, is of less value or is at a greater cost. No, the production of something leads to a greater cost than the actual value of that particular product. Okay, so economic growth based on current consumption's level really is not sustainable. And so they have this idea of uneconomic growth. Okay, but current generations are using up non-renewable resources and creating negative externalities, and this over time will, it's hard to argue not, we just don't know how long, lead to a decrease in the living standards of people around the world. Okay, so there you have it, the basics of like, does economic growth lead to economic development? The answer is kind of yes, but at what cost? And so development looks at, in the next chapter, is like, how do we deal with what this means? Okay, I hope you found this video to be helpful. We'll talk to you in a bit.